Hello, everyone, and welcome. Welcome to our monthly diversity, equity, and inclusion discussion. We have these discussions every month of the webinar so that we can focus on topics of diversity, equity, and inclusion, humanity and belonging, and justice. We bring you hard-hitting topics so that ones that are important to us as a society for us to acknowledge or share, or we bring you topics because we want to debunk some myths or simply to better understand some of the solutions around diversity, equity, and inclusion, which we're going to discuss today. So as we get started, I have a quick announcement that I want to make. I know in the month of December, we took off for the holidays, but in November, if you remember, we had Dr. Vic Baker and we had Janine K. Brown with us. In the past, you've joined our disruptive discussion with premier organizational designs, and I'm happy to announce that we, along with my thought partner, who you're going to meet in just a minute, have joined forces to start everyday organizational designs. So please click the follow button in LinkedIn because we're going to begin to educate and share tips and insights on our LinkedIn page. So I want us to introduce ourselves, and I'll start with me, and then I'm going to turn it over to Janine. So as a quick introduction, I'm Dei Zenobia Swift. Most people call me Dee, and I am the Chief Operating Officer of EOD Global. And I'm a 30-year plus DEI practitioner. I started in the DEI space before the term DEI was coined, and it was when we just focused on diversity. And that was just looking at the numbers of diverse people to bring into the organization. And we know that that's the foundational level, but doesn't create a culture of belonging. So Janine, do you want to introduce yourself?
Do, and I'm so excited that this is our first presentation to the world as Everyday Organizational Designs, or EOD Global. I feel like we need like party favors and confetti coming down. But for those of you, for everyone, hi, I'm Janine Brown. I am the Chief Executive Officer of EOD Global. It is my honor to be here with you. For the past 10 years, I've been providing solutions to organizations to help with their talent pipeline and their diversity, equity, inclusion strategy. And just really happy to be here today and looking forward to all of you spending time with us over the next 12 months and joining our webinars. So now I'm going to share a little bit about some of our services, and we're going to get right into the content. So some of the services that we provide are consulting. So we do a significant amount of DEI strategy consulting, which includes diagnostics, doing assessments and helping companies design their workplace assessments to capture information about training, about talent, and DEI, both the quantitative and the qualitative numbers. We design amazing, transformational, and fun workplace seminars in the areas of workplace well-being, career management, leadership development, and diversity, equity, and inclusion. And we also provide executive coaches. So we work with our clients, helping them to build high-performing workplaces by using coaches for both career management, but also coaching for diversity, equity, inclusion. So we also do that as well. So how can you work with us in the DEI space? So we have 3 products that we provide for DEI. The first one is our revolutionary software tool called Diversity DIY. So some of you were like, oh, we're doing diversity, but I wish we had better tools, resources, frameworks, templates that we could actually drop and fill in and execute upon. Well, guess what? EOD Global has those tools for you in a portal, one stop, a place to go get both templates, training, resources, videos, you name it, it's there. And so we do have that product. And then also we'll do it for you. We have a consulting-led strategy practice where we come in and we work with clients and we help them design their DEI strategy from nuts to bolts, from the beginning to the end, and we'll help you execute, maintain it, and also be able to transition it to you so that it is sustainable. And then we work with you. So we have a client-led approach. Some of our clients know what they want, they know how to do it, but they don't have all the people in place. And so we will help support you with the people. And these are just a few companies that we've worked with over the last couple of years. And so you know that we're working with some great brands out here, some that you may be familiar with and some that you don't, but we would love to work with you. So let's look at what today's agenda is about, because you came for some great content and we have it for you. So today we're going to talk to you about the DEI Maturity Model. So Diversity, Equity, Inclusion Maturity Model is a proprietary assessment tool that we've created to help you figure out where you are on your journey. Some of you think you might know, but we can help you be really clear and pinpoint where you are on the journey. And then we're going to get into why does the DEI journey stall? And this is an interactive conversation. So we want you guys to be really engaged in the chat window. Share some of the things that you've seen, maybe not at your company, but at another company, why they stall, because I'm sure it's not at your company. And then we're going to share some solutions with you. We're going to help you take action. And then at the end, we have a gift. So hang in there with us to the end. We have a special gift for you that we want to share with you at the end. All right, Darylyn, I'm turning back over to you.
All right, so let's start. Let's jump in and talk about the DEI maturity model that Janine just mentioned. So many organizations are eager to just jump into developing a DEI program, initiative, or journey, but they don't know where they currently are, which can be a reason for stalling because you haven't done some upfront work to understand where you are. But before you begin and try to jump into solutions, it's important to identify where your organization is currently. And that should happen before you even begin gathering data. So especially if you've already started some of your efforts, you want to know if you're doing the foundational work to move you through to having maturity where D&I is embedded into the DNA of the organization. Many times we talk to organizations and they've jumped well ahead of the foundational pieces. And then they wonder why the part they're working on doesn't have legs to stand on. So we've developed this free maturity model that will help you uncover where you are on the spectrum. It's a 15-minute organizational assessment, and we'll give you a code, a QC code later for you to be able to click on it and take that. And it will provide you with a snapshot of your organization's DEI maturity based on a linear continuum. This index helps you to measure your progress in 5 areas that include compliance and infrastructure, strategic planning, culture and investment, inclusive leadership, and HR and diverse workforce. We know that HR and diverse workforce is typically where people start, but you can see there's several different areas that you really need to focus on, and you can figure out from the assessment if you have some maturity in those areas, or if you're at a place anywhere along the spectrum of where you need to begin. So based on those responses, you identify the areas where you have stellar performance, as well as areas where you need to improve. And it provides resources for each of those factors, those 5, to guide your next steps toward creating a diverse, equitable, and inclusive workforce. So the questions are going to highlight opportunities to fully develop a strategy, to engage leaders and staff, and to integrate equity and inclusion in your policies, practices, and culture on 7 levels. Number 1 level is, are you exploring? Are you just starting to think about DEI? Level 2, are you beginning? This is where DEI is on the agenda and you're trying to figure out what to do. Level 3 is awareness. So you've started the work, you started gathering data and talking to your people. Level 4 is the development and initial application phase. And this is where most of the work happens, that foundational work, so that you have a great foundation for a successful DEI journey. And this is where a lot of organizations spend most of their time. So this is where you're developing your North Star, your DEI North Star, your strategic pathway, and your measures of success. Level 5 is foundational integration. So this is where you're inspired about DEI and your employees and leaders believe in the investment, and there's a clear return on investment for DEI. You're starting to look at having inclusive policies and practices as well. Then you have level 6, that's intermediate integration. You have a clear DEI culture and narrative, and it's running through your organization. Your leadership team and employees at all levels are working together to drive DEI throughout the organization. And then level 7 is thriving and sustaining. That is where DEI is in the DNA of your organization. You proactively, and when I say you, I'm talking about leaders and staff, everyone is proactively looking for opportunities for equity. And if you're there, you're to be congratulated for the work you've done. But then there's a question, like, have you considered sharing some of your best practices? We're a community. And when we have best practices, it's really important to share it with others. So this diversity maturity model, the results will place you on a maturity continuum, and it's going to provide you with a recommendation of tools, guidance, and resources to lead you on your pathway to DEI so that you can have it in the DNA of your organization. So when you don't know where you are, it's hard to build the right foundation. It's hard to build strategy. So that is a reason that DEI efforts can stall in the very beginning, because it kind of helps you set a baseline for organizations, inclusion and belonging. You can understand context, including your goals, your metrics, your current metrics, what your various stakeholders' concerns are, gathering their feedback. You get to then know when to incorporate other type of analysis of workforce demographics and following a roadmap with actions that's tied to specific metrics and goals. So we encourage you to step back and identify where you are before you move forward. So now let's jump into some of the reasons your DEI efforts might stall, which can vary based on your organization. And we're going to talk about leadership commitment, providing the right resources, communication, change management, centering your people, accountability, and a lot more. So let's jump right in. One big reason DEI efforts stall and sometimes fail to launch is because of fear, uncertainty, and doubt. There are DEI leaders that are so terrified about messing up and saying the wrong thing to all their stakeholders, their employees, their board of directors, their clients, their customers, or the wider world on social media, that they become paralyzed in inaction, or they're afraid of not doing the right thing. They might be afraid of people feeling as though they are blamed for discriminatory woes of the world, and they don't want to step on people's emotions with truth-telling. So they sit in that fear instead of moving DEI efforts along. But it's important, and Janine, we talked about this this past weekend at a conference that we went to, where it's important to know that fear is not doubt. Mm-hmm. So while fear can be an ally that stops you from stepping on landmines, it's a reaction that can stop you in your tracks. All of us have fears. Fear is triggered when you feel danger or that something's just not right. It's not always obvious to a situation, but when you have that awareness of you being in fear as opposed to being in doubt, and I'll tell you the difference in a second, you can act differently. So healthy fear alerts you, it warns you, it activates your adrenaline. So if we're in an area and someone screams out, duck or run, you're going to automatically respond to that, right? That's fear. And so sometimes fear keeps you safe through healthy caution. It motivates the mind to act, and it can help you operate on a level of self-defense. But doubt is not an ally to us. Doubt doesn't rescue you. It's not discernment. Doubt is when you're operating in a void or in the void, or you're operating based on what you don't know and you hesitate, and it can paralyze you. So while healthy fear wakes you up, doubt demoralizes you. Yeah. So knowing the difference between the two, that doubt of the what is actually okay, but it can't stop you or lead you to inaction. And we'll do more, you can think you'll do more harm than good for your employees when you operate in doubt and the communities you serve. Janine, did you want to say something?
Yeah, and I think, one of the things that I definitely want people to take away from this, and tying this back to how does your DEI journey stall? And I think it's that not knowing how DEI is going to benefit our organization. And we hear this when we're talking with leaders all the time. It's like, well, we're doing great. We're profitable. We have great products and services. Our clients are happy. Our employees are relatively happy. They hadn't told us that they're unhappy. And so I think when we think about how to move forward, I think it's moving past how is this going to benefit us. I think in the long run, organizations need to see if we don't implement and execute on our DEI strategy or a DEI strategy, what's the long-term risk that we're facing? And I think that's the biggest part. I think when we think about fear, we're thinking about human emotions. And right. Dale, and I think that's what you described, but we're making business decisions in a space of using our human emotions around fear and uncertainty, where we don't do that when we're about to launch a new product, right? And I think we have to see these things as the same. So don't allow fear and uncertainty and doubt to and even the conversations, right? There's a number of water cooler conversations now, Zoom room conversations about, what does DEI mean for our organization? Are they going to start teaching us that we're racist? I think that's the number one thing I hear when I'm working with corporate clients is that word. It's like, we're not racist, and DEI is more than that. And so much more. Yeah. So don't be afraid, one, that you see yourself, right? That we all see our shortcomings in this space and continue to move forward. So I think that's how I'd like to kind of move through that one.
Yeah, I agree with that. And it's important to realize that, when we operate off of even our own fragility, we're missing an opportunity to learn. We're missing an opportunity to identify how we can embrace other communities of people because we're centering ourselves. And so it's important that we don't center ourselves. And we'll talk about that a little bit later. And sometimes when we're operating in doubt, it's doubt of the impact to self, or it's the doubt of self itself. Let's talk about the next one. And it's no support or accountability. So when we think about no support or accountability, when organizations begin their journey to greater diversity, equity, and inclusion, sometimes that starting point is educating leaders and staff on what DEI is and what it isn't. Because many people have different concepts of what diversity, equity, and inclusion and belonging means. And sometimes that's based on our own identities and the intersectionalities that we have. So getting each employee at least on the same page often involves us creating an awareness and understanding how to foster an environment that's built on DEI. And when we do that, we can start to explore accountability systems, what they look like, how they can be implemented, how to ensure that we're being efficient and effective, and being able to have those accountability measures throughout the organization.
Yeah. So, Darlene, you are spot on. And if your CEO and your C-suite executives are not participating in training, and they're not communicating the message of your DEI strategy, it's going to fail. Because if it doesn't appear to be important, and others, like Darlene was just saying, are not held accountable for executing, then people won't believe that it's a real strategy, that it's important to the organization. So I think you're spot on, Darylyn, with that one.
Yeah, and what's interesting is I'm a believer that our employees help to own the process because it's happening to them. And people always think of the WIFM, what's in it for me? But I'm also a firm believer that our leaders, from the CEO throughout the organization, of the executive leadership team, they have to own it and drive it. They have to put the resources behind it. We're going to talk about the resources in just a minute. And when they don't, it says something very different to your staff, your clients, your community, your customer. It says something very different. So thinking about the support and accountability is crucial. And without an accountability system in place, your DEI efforts will stall and they might fail. So if you've developed a pathway that doesn't include an accountability system, then you need to step back and look at how are we going to hold our leaders accountable? And leaders have to hold each other accountable and not be afraid to provide feedback to each other. An organization can't grow and thrive if those in positions of power and those in positions of privilege are not being held accountable for their actions, and if they're not walking the talk, and if they're not showing support. And there is a large organization who recently has been facing accusations of misconduct by several employees who are saying that they're being discriminated against and harassed. And the organization has an opportunity to, one, make excuses, or to two, own it. To own it, to do the work to find out why and how it can be mitigated and moving forward, and then to be transparent about what's going on. We'll talk about transparency in a minute. So as I wrap up this piece, when creating accountability systems, you have to ask yourself, what is the process to report misconduct and bad behavior within the organization, even if it's happening by a leader? And how can we feel safe and feel that we won't be retaliated against if we do? Because when there's not accountability systems in place, when there's not obvious leadership support, then sometimes, going back to the fear, our employees, our staff can have a fear that if they speak up, that it'll be detrimental to them.
Yeah. So our next one is being underfunded. So if your DEI strategy is not funded or underfunded, it is definitely going to stall, right? We want, and I want you to look at creating a budget for your DEI strategy as an investment. It is an investment. It is not just an expense. And I think oftentimes organizations look at this as overhead and an unnecessary expense or another expense, right? Just like your accounting and your tax organization and sales is an investment in the bottom line, so is your DEI strategy. And so I definitely want you, if you don't take anything else away from this particular segment, remember DEI is an investment, and that we want to make sure that it is done, that you align and you have a specific line item, that is funded every year and is adequately funded so that you can have the support to execute on programs and initiatives. Our next one is, it appears performative. So y'all know, a lot of times you hear about these DEI strategies, or we're doing a training, and it's to respond to bad behavior.
Right.
We're responding to someone made a comment. And I actually have a real story. We got a call from a prospective client wanting us to immediately do some unconscious bias training. They hadn't done any training in their organization around DEI at all. They didn't have a DEI strategy. They didn't have a DEI leader, but they had someone making really bad comments at a plant down in Texas. And they wanted us to solve for that problem. Now, I do believe there was some sincere urgency in that particular scenario. But what we find is that a lot of companies are just constantly trying to respond to something in their organization. It could be bias, it could be bad press, it could be an employee on Twitter or an ex-employee on Twitter slamming the organization. So their brand is being impacted by that. But the reason that your DEI, your journey will stall will be because it appears that there's no sincerity. There's no specific strategy. There's not a plan, right? You just haphazardly jumped into it, and it appears very performative.
Janine,
go ahead, Dylan.
Can we go back? Because Jerry asked in the chat box, can you talk about budget in terms of company size and company revenue?
Yeah, I am so glad you asked that question, Jerry. And thank you for joining today as well. One of the things that I've done with some of my clients is, put a head count on a dollar amount per person on what the DEI budget should be based on the size of your organization, right? And so I think that this is just my opinion. I will say this is not scientific, but I really believe that each employee, an investment in each employee's, and we're just looking at training. Say we're looking at training, we're building a strategy. I think a robust DEI strategy cannot be less than $100,000 a year, right? And that's a combination of both consulting, using a consultant that has expertise to be able to help you design actionable strategic plans that have goals and accountability, right? And it's measurable within the organization. If we're looking at training, I would say that training, on average, your training budget should be anywhere, depending on the size of your organization. From a headcount standpoint, I would say a minimum of $550 per employee. And that depends on what that how you're designing that journey. But training should be a plan, right? And it should be embedded. We're going to talk about this a little bit more, how to set up that training throughout your organization. So I would say an organization that really wants to do it right should be allocating at least on a minimum of $100,000 annually on the strategy design, and maybe an additional $25,000 to $50,000 for just training initiatives related to their DEI strategy.
And I want to add to that, I think that's really good framework, but I want to add to that. Many people will hear that number and they'll say, oh, $100,000 is a lot. I want you to think about the cost of your people. I want you to think about the cost of recruitment. I want you to think about the cost of retention, because when you have staff that don't feel as though they belong, when you have staff that don't feel as though they're cared for, when you have, you're operating in an environment where there's not a sense of psychological safety, there's a cost to that. Mm-hmm. So you can pay the cost on the front end, or you can pay the cost on the back end with lost productivity, loss of employees, and more. So don't just look at the number, look at the benefit. And the benefit is not always to your bottom line. Think about the benefit to your people.
Yeah, we have a client that has about 400 employees. They're all based in the same city. Now, everybody's working remote, but they're pretty much, they have one location. And their annual spend on their DEI strategy, working with consultants and training, is about $150,000 a year. And that's 400 employees, right? And so it's a significant amount of work. Now, I do believe over the aggregate, some of that strategy work goes down. They also can use tools like our portal, where they take more ownership as they mature in the process. So they're able to do a lot of work without consulting oversight. But I think it depended, if you're in that first 1 to 4 stages that Darylyn spoke about earlier, I would expect for you to be spending that amount of money. So Jerry, I hope that helped with you and some future planning. And so the next one that we want to cover is that another reason that your DEI journey will stall is because you're looking at lived experiences over learned experiences. Now, what do I mean by that? When I'm talking about this, we're talking about in the frame of who is actually leading, managing, and responsible for your DEI strategy internally within your organization. We find that a lot of times, a couple of things happen. We pick great people to lead our DEI initiative, But it's because maybe they're Black, maybe because they're a woman, they're Asian, right? They have something that's different than the larger majority in the organization. That's a lived experience. However, what we also find is that they stall and run into gridlock faster because they're missing that learned expertise. And I want to be really clear here. It might sound like a bias, but DEI is a profession. You know, my former profession was accounting. More specifically, it was state and local tax. It was a learned experience. I was not hired by my firm because I filed taxes, tax returns, right? It was a learned experience. And I want you all to think about DEI in the same way. And if this is your responsibility in your organization, I'm sure you feel this a lot, right? It's like, how do I balance my lived experiences with my learned expertise? And the reason this is important is because you have to be able to understand how the data and the research in this particular area informs how you execute internally on your organization. You need to be able to understand, how do you write a strong strategy for DEI? The strategies that we design are often 25 to 40 pages. It is a strategic plan that requires execution and goals. So while, you know, we want to make sure that we have great people in these roles, we want to make sure that your organization can move forward and be able to execute, because we've seen it when people don't have that learned expertise and the challenges that it causes, not only for the larger organization, but that person becomes frustrated and unengaged and disengaged, and then nothing happens, because right. DEI is more than just activities, events, and training.
Absolutely. Let's talk about lack of transparency. So employees, I'm a firm believer that employees should be kept in the loop the entire way through the process. Otherwise,
communication.
You have to communicate. You have to communicate, and you have to communicate with a change management lens. Otherwise, they can feel disengaged and stop your efforts. So I tell I use this story, an analogy that is in a book called Switch. And I use it all the time because it's really powerful. In this book, Switch, and it's about change management, it gives the analogy of the elephant and the rider. And what you have is an elephant that's going to weigh about 2 tons, and you have a rider that's probably going to weigh about 200 pounds. Now, the elephant represents the organization. The rider represents the leadership. Why? Because you usually have a lot less leadership. Hopefully you have a lot less people that's on your leadership team that's driving the huge number of people that you have in the organization. As long as that rider is driving the elephant in a place that they want to go, you're fine. But what happens when they come to the fork in the road and you are trying to get the elephant to go to the left, but the elephant wants to go to the right? I want you to think about, which way are you really going to go? You're either not going anywhere because they're going to stop your efforts, or you're going to go to the right. They can derail your efforts. And that really happens only when you don't communicate. You're not able to share your vision and your mission in a way that they get it. They understand the sense of urgency. Here's the change management part. They understand the sense of urgency. You're communicating every step of the way, and they trust you. So have you created that environment where you're communicating, you're incorporating change management, and they trust you? Yeah. So you have to ask some questions. Do you let them know what you're doing well? That's what we typically do. Do you also let them know what you're struggling with? Do you let them know when you're failing and ways that you're going to course correct? Are you being transparent? Because that's where trust comes in. And if you're not, they won't continue to trust you and these DEI efforts. Even when there's someone that feels discriminated against, they'll feel that it's going back to being performative, that you're doing it because it's going to benefit the organization or because there's social pressures. And as much, go ahead.
Yeah.
And that's not We love the companies that we work with. Many of us do. Many of us are there for a paycheck. So if you're doing this for the company to benefit, your employees are not going to feel cared for. Mm-hmm. And if you're not being transparent, they can derail your efforts. So think of it this way. There used to be an old saying of people, we communicate with people who are on a need to know basis. Think about everybody needs to know. Over communicate. Tell them every step of the way. Have those feedback loops so that you can get their idea on how things are moving. And if people who are within the organization have great ideas, listen to them. And if it's something you can't implement for whatever reason, share that with them too. We at the leadership level spend too much time holding on to information, which is a trust buster. It doesn't move people to trust you. And in order for them to help move the DEI efforts along, because leadership can't do it by themselves. You've got to engage the people. You have to get them to trust you. And in order for them to trust you, have to communicate.
Yeah, your DEI journey, strategy, initiatives is not a surprise party.
Yes.
Can I drop the mic?
You can drop the mic.
I'll drop the mic on. All right.
It is not. It is not. Okay, I'm looking at the time. We've got 10 minutes left. So I want to cover this next one really quickly. And it's when our biases go unchecked. And that includes organizational bias, which creates inequities throughout the organization, which will not move your organization forward. People can operate so often in this is how we've done it and be able to make decisions for people that are being impacted without checking with the people who are being impacted. And we often make wrong decisions. So conducting those equity lenses, asking those right questions, being able to step back and look at it from not our lens, but from the lens of the various different communities and their intersections are really important. So when we think about our biases going unchecked, I want to give you an example. So we have a client up in Portland, Oregon, who decided to do a great project. And it was for people in the affordable, who are lower income. So they decided to do it based on an area code that typically has lower income people. However, what they didn't do is take into consideration that there's also middle class and a certain subset of wealthy people that share that same area code or zip code rather, that share that same zip code. So when they put out this program, they didn't think about, do the people who are lower income, are we marketing to them correctly? Do they have the resources to find out about the information? Are we making sure that we're marketing specifically to where they live and not the whole zip code as a whole? Just a few things that they needed to think about, because what ended up happening was that people who were middle class and upper class ended up taking the benefits and getting the benefits of this that was meant for people in the lower income community. Now, where a bias comes in is as we walk through, how did this happen? Some of the answers from the organization was, well, we communicated, we had marketing, they putting it on the people who did not find out about the benefit to them. They didn't apply. Well, why didn't they apply? There were some biases built into why people weren't able to take advantage of the offering that they had. And when we dissect that, when we peel back the layer and make you check your blind spots, that's when you're able to say, okay, I've got to do more work on myself and at the organizational level. And when we don't do that work, we don't check our biases, our staff feel it. They know it. They feel it. They might be a part of that community, or they might see how the inequities are happening to them. And again, and you'll hear me say this all the time, they won't feel cared for, which is very much a key.
Yeah. And also just check your policies and procedures, right? Because oftentimes we find that companies are doing great programmatic sorts of things, but the bias is in the process and the procedures, how people get promoted, how they're identified and hired, what does the salary, what are the pay gaps between men and women, people across racial lines. So those are some other biases that you definitely want to be aware of. And then finally, the other reason, one of the last reasons, there's more reasons than this, but this is another big reason, is that there's a lack of and inconsistent training. So you might not be doing any training and it's inconsistent. And I want to start with the last one, inconsistent training. The way to get past inconsistent training is to embed DEI in all training. The sales team's training, the finance department, human resources, everybody who's being trained in the organization, there is a lens of DE&I in that training. That is the best way to get past the inconsistency, because then it's a part of our everyday conversation. We're looking at solutions through the lens of DEI. The lack of training is, come on, y'all, let's just start training, right? Let's start putting together a training plan. What do we want to solve for? How do we want to educate people on these? And it's still, I'm sure for a lot of people, still somewhat amazing that this is the work that's being undertaken in our companies and organizations. So just that's another reason why your DEI journey will stall. And let's look at some of the solutions here, because we've given you a lot of reasons why. We kind of coupled some solutions in there, but let's look at, we have about 6 solutions that we want to share with you really quickly. And the first one is we want to use a top-down approach and center your people. So that's again, right. If your executives start your DEI journey, refresh your DEI journey, and regularly every year, at the top of every fiscal year or calendar year, make sure your executives are involved, right? They're being trained on new ideologies. They're being aware of new statistical and research, right? They know what the research is and what the research is saying and how that applies to your organization. And make sure that they're focused on their people, both the people they hire, who serve their clients, and the people that they serve. And then finally, the people in the community. And the next one.
It's really quickly before you move on. I think it's important that you continually make sure they connect it to their why.
Yeah.
Why are they committed to driving DEI within their organization? Is it an internal commitment because of something that's happening within the organization, or because they're committed to their people? Or is it something external, social pressures? What is their why? That's important to capture.
And then let's allocate resources. Put a budget together. Remember, I gave you an example. A company that has 400 employees is spending about $125,000 to $150,000 a year. So that's your baseline. What can I be doing? And how should I allocate for that? And that does not include an FTE. So that's just on executing programs. That does not include the salary of someone who is responsible for overseeing or managing that, but also allocate people resources. Again, this is a profession, this is an investment, and this is another business line for your organization. And so put the right people in place, both with lived experiences, because we all have those, but definitely with learned expertise. That could be through a consultant, or that could definitely be with a direct hire who's responsible for that, managing your DEI process. And then next, make it your mission, right? It's in the DEI is in the DNA of your organization. You're constantly finding ways to streamline the work so that it speaks to equity for everyone, right? Because our goal is to help you create a workplace where everyone thrives. It's everybody is the beneficiary, but we're also all responsible to make sure that everyone benefits from the DEI strategy. So make it your organization's mission. If it's not in your mission statement, let's go back and add it, right? We've seen recently Facebook updated their mission statement, and they spoke to building community, right? So just because the mission was created in 1906 doesn't mean it can't be updated. All right, Darla, you can take those last 3.
Also, we want to make sure we hire qualified professionals. When Janine was talking about allocating the right resources, it's important to understand that DEI work is a profession. It is not, people can jump on the bandwagon and say, oh, I'm going to include DEI in my consulting practice. We want to be very careful of that. Make sure people understand the strategy of DEI, the journey of DEI, the different levels of maturity of DEI, because you can actually do more harm than good if you don't have the right foundation. And that's why, using consultants, even to help you, even if you don't want them to drive the process, but to help you, or using tools. We happen to have the diversity DIY one-stop shop toolkit, but finding whatever resources and having a qualified professional to help guide you through is very important. And then also data. Data. The saying, what gets measured gets managed. If you don't have data, and specifically in the beginning, having disaggregated data so that you know the impact on different communities of people, then you really don't know where you need to start. You don't know what the pain points are in the organization. After you gather that disaggregated data, then you can start to develop a strategy and set goals and figure out what your outcomes are. What's your key performance indicators, and what's the DEI North Star? And then last but not least, you cannot communicate enough. People want to know your why. They want to know your what, who, how, when, and where. You have to communicate and do it in a manner that speaks to people's emotions. Yes, we tell them all of the processes and the policies, but you also have to speak to people's emotions, because that is a driving force for many. Pew Research and McKinsey Research and another organization asked or tried to uncover what's one of the motivating factors for people at work. And it was for them to feel cared for. Mm-hmm. Yeah. It's for them to feel cared for.
Yeah, I want to answer Trina's question in the chat window. What do you do when your CEO doesn't want to focus on the data? Talk to your COO. I think part of the challenge most people have with data is how it's delivered to them. So I always find with our clients, we try to give it to them in fun and informative ways as well. So, we want to be clear, but we also want to incorporate it with storytelling. And I think that's the key to sharing statistical and outcomes and the KPIs, because oftentimes people think the data is going to tell us where we're wrong and what we're not doing right. But really, I think the storytelling about where you've come, how this data informs where you should go, and then just finding creative ways to present that information is really important, especially with people who don't want to hear it, don't want to see it. And then, like I said, if the CEO won't listen, go to the COO. And I bet the CFO would love to see it, Trina. So yeah.
Another thing that's important is you've got your quantitative data and your qualitative data. And so with the quantitative data, that's of course about the numbers, but the qualitative data tells you a lot. So are you having some employee listening sessions where you can just talk about what the employees are saying and then give a little bit of quantitative information there? But maybe you should lead with the qualitative data. Maybe you should lead with—
This is what we're hearing. Yeah.
Right. This is what we're hearing. Here's the impact to our staff. And sometimes CEOs respond to risk. So what's the risk of us not focusing on DEI? Yeah. So you might, want to start there as well.
Yeah. And let's take action. So I'm going to run through these really quickly and we're going to say goodbye. So how can you take action and how can your organization take action? Ask this question every month. Why? Start with the why. Why are you undertaking DEI? What have you done? And is it speaking back to that why? Revisit your executives and leadership commitment. I think that should be an annual commitment. It's like renewing your vows every year, right? It's, so, and they understand what that means. Right. And then communicate. Create a communication plan. Create a launch plan that communicates, celebrate with t-shirts and things to memorialize And get people engaged. We all love a good party. So get people involved. And then set actionable goals and measure them regularly, right? So we don't just set KPIs on the front end. We want to measure those, annually, semi-annually, quarterly. And then finally, take the maturity assessment that we have for you. And that's our gift. So on the screen, you'll see, again, the DI maturity assessment. We're going to also put the link in the chat window. You can scan the QR code and it will take you, yes, like Darylyn, scan the QR code and take the assessment and find out where you are. There's no commitment. It'll just let you know where you are. It takes about 10 to 12 minutes to go through it.
Yes, and the scanning works. I just tried it, and guess what pulled up? The DEI maturity assessment. So go ahead, scan it, pull it up, take it, and really think through the questions. Yeah. Get a quiet space for 15 minutes to really dig in, and it'll help you think of, oh, I haven't started that. That's okay.
That's okay.
That's okay. It's best to know where you are.
And share it. If you have an internal DEI committee of volunteers who are responsible for leading this, capture the link or share the URL with them. So you all can see, because I think we all have a different lens, like our eyes and our involvement in our organization. So we might think different things. It's a great way to have a conversation and level set where you are. So we want to thank you all for participating today. And feel free to reach out to us directly with any questions. If you have questions, feel free to drop them in the chat. If we have a little more time, you can reach out to us by phone, on LinkedIn, and via email. And we would love to spend some time talking with you to hear about what you're stalled on and be able to give you some insights on how to move forward. Darylyn?
Absolutely. We appreciate it. We appreciate you. Carla dropped the assessment link in case you are not able to scan. She dropped the assessment link in the chat box. So go and grab that. Also, if you want to just drop your email address in the chat box, we promise we won't just send a bunch of spam to you, but we can send it to you in that manner as well. As you know, we have our discussions every month. We want to know what you want to talk about. Our goal is to give you what you need to help you move through your DEI journey, just as many of us have done in the past. We know that it's not always easy and you need some support. So leave us your name and your email address so that we can reach out to you and ask what support you need from us. And again, go to LinkedIn at EOD Global and subscribe or hit the like button or whatever it is you do in LinkedIn, follow, whatever it is you do in LinkedIn, do that. And then that way you'll be able to get some of the tools and the insights that we'll be putting on our page.
Well, thank you, everyone. Have a great day and enjoy the rest of your week.